Finishing up the old Fender Reverb unit, I have changed out the filter caps, changed out the dropping resistor there, everything neat, nice and cleaned up. Time to put the cover back on. Down here at the power transformer end, in order to make room for the new cable gland and the 3 conductor power cable, I had to drill 2 new holes to move the power transformer about a 1/2 inch, a little over to the right. And then I was able to use one of the old holes there to put in a 2 terminal strip, which let me join the neutral and one of the primaries there. And then the hot goes to the fuse, then to the switch. So it's all to modern safety code now, much better. The rest of the inside was just like any other 60s Fender. So changing out the electrolytics, had 1 bad yellow Astron, so I've got a Jupiter in there. I replaced the old cathode resistor for the, I almost said the output tube. The 6K6 is used like an output tube to drive the reverb transformer. Anyway, I replaced that resistor with a 2-watt metal film there. Everything else is pretty much original except for the 2.2 meg resistors here on the input going for the dry preamp tube, not the reverb, the dry portion of the signal. It's held in place with a 2.2 meg to ground and a 2.2 meg from the B+, and that's how this whole tube section is biased. I don't want to get into too much, but those 2 megs were very, very noisy, and now they are not. The only other change I've made is here. I've added a 1 meg resistor across the foot switch for the reverb, because without it, it was popping. The AB763 amp circuit of the period had a 220K resistor to ground from that same point. The later Fender reissue version of this amp used a 1 meg. I put a 1 meg in there. All it is doing is de-popping that foot switch so that when you turn the reverb off, there's not a... Makes no difference to the sound otherwise. Everything cleaned up really nicely inside, and the unit's working pretty well overall. There's a little bit of a buzz on the reverb part, but not on the dry part, and it just seems to be part of the circuit. There's no DC there or anything. It's just not the world's quietest reverb, but it does offer an awful lot of reverb. Now, temporarily, I'm using this, which is a no-no. I'm using this just so I can demonstrate this without a ground loop. If this were mine, and what I will recommend to the owner, is that we get him an actual box with a high-quality isolation transformer in there to use between this and his amp so there won't be a ground loop. Because running this chassis without a safety ground, you can die. Anything that gets this much high voltage that has AC mains in it has to be shielded for code, and it really should be shielded, but that does create ground loops. The modern reissue of the circuit gets around the ground loop problem by having all the grounds on a PCB, which is only tied to chassis at one point through 2 Zehners and a cap. So there's a floating ground. It's referenced to the chassis, which is at earth ground, but the audio path does not do that. And I would love to do that to this amp, but this thing has so many, has multiple chassis connections. It's really not feasible to do that. If I were building one from scratch, I would build with that in mind. But this is, an original example, so it's better to use an isolation transformer in a box to just do a professional ground lift that way. That's why the current reissue is safe, but doesn't do this. I'm not sure the current reissue sounds as good. They sound pretty good, though. I'm running into it and then going into one of the amps here across the room. Amp set clean, no effects on the amp. So we're going to start with it set mixer all the way to the left at 1, wholly dry. And there's a little bit of noise on the input if I roll the volume down on the guitar. It's not the tubes, it's not the resistors. I suspect it's because of the way they're doing the stage. It's an AC coupled cathode follower stage. And if anyone out there has run into this on this amp and knows how to correct that DC on the input without radically changing it, I'm all ears. I don't want to make too many changes to this because it's a rare original piece. And maybe they all did it. I haven't had one of these original ones in over a decade. I just don't remember. And I looked online, I found no information about that. But it's not the tubes, it's not the resistors, and it's not the wires, so I'm kind of at a loss other than it's the circuit. Something else to be aware of is if I mute the reverb and then I turn the mixer up, it gets darker. Which means when I undo the foot switch and you hear the reverb, everything sounds pretty cool. But if you then use the foot switch to mute the reverb, your dry sound gets really dark compared to how it actually is. Now I'll turn the dwell all the way up, get it really nice and wet and juicy. That's with the tone down. Let me turn the tone up. A little bit of that hiss coming in there. That's just unavoidable. It might be a little bit better when the rear panel is in place. You can hear that the dwell also affects the tone of the reverb. In fact, the dwell affects the sound of the guitar too. So it's an imperfect device, but still a cool sounding device. Most people are probably going to run the dwell from noon to from 5 to 10, somewhere in that range. Really high up for more of a surf thing, a little bit down for more of a subdued, subtle thing. And you can also turn the tone down to make the reverb go farther in the background. I find about 1 o'clock-ish is kind of like you're used to on an amp. So let's dial in kind of what we'd be used to hearing on a Fender Twin or Deluxe reverb. So yeah, I'm happy with how this has come out so far. It's very clean, looks great, performs very well. I would like to get rid of that remaining DC that affects the volume pot of a guitar, but it's minor, and if we have to live with it, so be it. As I pointed out, with the dwell and the reverb mix and the tone and the foot switch, the tone can change in some kind of weird ways. But they're just kind of odd quirks. Most people have learned to live with them. And given the owner's 1960 concert and 61 Princeton, 65 Bassman, I think this old reverb unit's going to get a lot of productive use. Thanks for watching.